and of course you want to base everything in prayer when it's an obstacle,
Exactly.
but we know that God will never put an insurmountable obstacle in our way if he wants it to be overcome, it will be.
Yeah.
So put it in his hands,
Yeah.
and he'll help you figure out if you go over, around, under it, or through it.
Howdy, and welcome to the True North Leader Podcast. I'm Bobby Albert, and we're here today with David Wills, and he is the President Emeritus of the National Christian Foundation. So, David, welcome to the show.
It's fantastic to be here, Bobby. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this time together.
Yeah, I really do too. For our audience benefit, David grew up in the town that I grew up in, and that's Wichita Falls, Texas. So, because we're both from Texas, we're going to both be able to understand each other. We won't have to pass out any Texas dictionaries between you and me. So, David, man, you have lived a full life, and you're still going. You're still going. And tell us a little bit about you and about the National Christian Foundation, and share a little bit even about your family, because you got a bunch of kids.
Well, I guess I'd start by saying that I'm the son of Don and Susu, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yes, I am the husband of Chris and the father of Jonathan, Maggie, Chuck, Luke, Josh, Drew, and Sam. There's 7 of them. And the father-in-law of Abby and Courtney, and now just 76 days ago became the grandfather of baby Max.
Wow. Congratulations.
Not that I'm counting the days, but yes. In fact, we actually became empty nesters the day before Max was born, which is really strategic timing. So my wife never just had to look at me. I'd say a couple of other things, though, that really have shaped me is the friendships that God has put in my path. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And the fact that Jesus saved me when I was 10 years old, had a Billy Graham crusade in Texas Stadium. It was the first event ever held at Texas Stadium, and my mom and dad put me in the back of the Buick station wagon. We went down to Irving, Texas. Really, I think to hear Johnny Cash, who was the opening act for this guy named Billy Graham. That was the night that I came to faith. And so, I grew up in Wichita Falls, as did my wife. We actually grew up in the same neighborhood. I met her when she was 5 years old, but don't worry, we didn't start dating till we were in our 20s. We don't do that kind of stuff in Wichita Falls. So, we now live outside of Waco, near a place called Crawford, Texas, and just love being back home in Texas. We were in Georgia for 25 years before that. And then your next question was NCF, or
share a little bit about NCF, and that's for, stands for National Christian Foundation. So
yeah, NCF is extraordinary. This is our 40th anniversary for NCF. And so it's been around for a long time, and we are very privileged to be able to help mobilize resources and inspire biblical generosity, which has just been a real blessing. And I can talk even more about that if you'd like.
Well, y'all have accomplished, I think, far greater than most people even realize. And if I just some things I looked at you are, the organization is approaching about 300 employees. I mean, that's not small stuff. So do you go ahead and share a little bit about what y'all have accomplished? Because I'm really fascinated, and I think there's a lot of people in the audience that needs this service. So please share a little bit more about it.
Oh, absolutely. So just a little bit about NCF and what we do. So, Bobby, most people have a financial plan, but not many people have a giving plan to think through their giving. We're much better about having a budget and a financial plan
Yeah.
than we are a giving plan.
Yeah.
And so we really help people think through that. So there's three questions that people ask with regards to their personal generosity. Why should I be generous? How do I do that? Where should I give? And as people continually through their lives ask and answer that question better and better, the more well planned they are. And people who are well planned, they give more and they give more wisely.
Yeah.
And so that's what we get to help people do. And it's really actually been staggering what God has done. So we're, obviously we're a grant. We serve about 25,000 families now. Just so far this year, this is kind of a little bit staggering, but we've made grants of about $1.6 billion to almost 30,000 organizations just this year. And so it's crazy. The God has just moved in ways that defied all of our expectations.
Yeah. Hey, David, you've also written a couple books. You want to share a little bit about them?
Sure. We've written two books. The first one was Investing in God's Business. And that's really a book. It's probably way out of date. So I'm hesitant to even talk about it because it has some technical aspects to it. But it's really a kind of a primer for people to think through different ways. It's a how question book, that middle question.
Okay.
How do you do your giving? And it actually gives stories of people that have done some unusual things with regards to how they have done their giving. And that's what that book is about. Family Money is the second book, and it's a pretty catchy title. It's about family and money. And it's really, it's really a book full of questions that are helpful for families to think through when they are working on developing a giving plan for passing on all of their resources, whether it's to family or to charity. And if you don't make those decisions, you'll get to pass it on to the government. Yeah. And so that little book helps. It's just full of questions that are helpful for families to think through.
Yeah. Now, since you've moved near Waco, Texas, you're a Baylor Bear, right?
Yes, sir. I sure am.
Yeah.
I hope that you're not. I'm sorry if there are any Red Raiders listening. But actually, I'm not sorry. I was actually very, very happy at what happened this weekend. Now, of course, this podcast isn't going to come out until January.
Yeah.
So who knows what? We head to Oklahoma this weekend, and I am the son of a Sooner, and I'm married to a Sooner. So I have to be very tempered in what I say.
Yeah. Yeah. We want you to be careful, and the season will, about the time this podcast come out, the season will probably be over. So, and you got a law degree there. You went to you got your bachelor's degree and a law degree, and then you went to Dallas Theological Seminary, and boy, you are a passionately, for personal growth, and because you went on to Oxford University, you just got a real fascination in learning.
Well, that's kind of something that, was passed down from my mom and dad. As you may recall, my dad was very involved in education in Wichita Falls.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was instilled in all of us at a very early age. Being a lifelong learner is just kind of, I guess it's just baked into my DNA from the very get-go. And I love to go to school, and I love to learn. And so I'm not sure what's next, but maybe there's another degree lurking out there somewhere. But
well, you said something there. I'm trying to remember. Didn't your dad serve on the school board, the public school board? Okay.
Yeah, he was the president of the school board.
That's what that was a long time ago. So
yes, it was.
And I know for our audience, I find this fascinating, but I asked David, since he's lives near Crawford, does he see George W. Bush? And share us a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, when you live out this way, as I was telling Bobby, that there are a very limited number of places you can eat out here. So we've got Crawford, we've got Clifton Valley Mills, McGregor, but there is actually one particular restaurant in McGregor that serves these pies that are just absolutely extraordinary. And I'm afraid W has taken a real liking to these pies. So if you want to run into George W. and Laura, you should go to the Coffee Cafe in McGregor, because that's a place where you might have a sighting.
Yeah, well, I was sharing with David, before we started the recording, is I got to know George W. Back in 1988. I mean, boy, that's a long time ago. And I traveled with him a couple of times back then. Through him, I got to know Carl Rove. I got to know Rick Perry. Of course, Rick Perry served just like George W. as governor of Texas. And so anyway, Rick Perry lived pretty near Wichita Falls, so just a little bit out West Texas. So, well, David, you might have already addressed this, but why do you feel so passionate about what you and the National Christian Foundation do you have anything else to add about that?
Wow. It's just been such a privilege to walk alongside these my job is just kind of ridiculous. So I spend a portion of my time working alongside the most generous people you've ever met. I mean, they're just extravagantly generous, and walking alongside these churches and ministries that are just doing the most phenomenal work. And I get paid to do that. So it's a great gig. So yeah, every day I wake up and I'm going to be interacting with multiple of each one of those. I mean, it's easy to get up in the morning and get going. And it's just a privilege. And, Aslan is on the move in the world in extraordinary ways. And it is fun to be kind of sitting at a place to see some of that happening.
Yeah, I bet it is. And just to meet the people you're talking about, I'm sure you have heard lots of stories about people and their background that, it's invaluable. In fact, I'm sure you could write a third book just on the stories of the people that you've met over, because you've been part of that organization for how long has it been?
Man, 25 years, close to 25 years.
So. Yeah, that's so what brought you to the place of leadership in the organization? How did you get connected there?
Wow, that's a good question. So it's kind of a multi-step process, I think I'd have to say. I first met a fellow named Greg Sperry, who was a fellow lawyer, and really went to work with him. And we met a guy named Terry Parker. So we were actually in St. Simon's Island, Georgia, which is a nice place to be. We lived there for a little over 5 years. And then Terry was in Atlanta. And we had started one foundation. Terry had started another foundation, and we eventually learned of each other and built a relationship. And that kind of trifecta continues to this day. But that's really how I got connected to the National Christian Foundation. And Terry probably made the greatest risk move he ever made when he asked me to come and serve as the first president of NCF. So I don't think he regrets it, but I haven't asked him, so I'm not going to ask him. So.
Yeah, well, but in addition to him, there were a couple of other co-founders. Do you mind sharing a little? about that as well.
Oh, certainly. Yes, Larry Burkett and Ron Blue.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating story, and I can't do it justice because I mean there are few people that can tell stories as well as Terry Parker can. Let me tell you. But so Terry was a lawyer in Atlanta, and he did a lot of the nonprofit work for organizations and Christian businesses in Atlanta back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And he had these two clients, one named Ron Blue and one named Larry Burkett. Nobody had ever heard of them. Their organizations had not even started, but they both found their way to Terry Parker.
Wow.
And Terry, who can sometimes see around corners, he thought to himself as he was starting this thing, he said, I think someday people are going to know who these guys are. And so he asked them if they would be on the founding board of NCF. This was in 1982. And so sure enough, there are a few people that ended up knowing who Larry Burkett and Ron Blue were. And so when I went to work for NCF, those were my three bosses, Terry Parker, Larry Burkett, and Ron Blue.
Wow.
Which was just, it was wow. That's exactly right.
Wow. That's something. That is really something. It's interesting that the organization started in 1982. And it's also interesting to me that you shared a while ago about going to the Texas Stadium and praying to receive Christ. Actually, September 1st of 1982 was the year that, or the time when I prayed to receive Christ. And until that time, I was one of those people. I knew a lot about God, but I didn't know God. And on that day, a friend that I had not seen in several years, and there's more of a testimony to all of this, but it was very clear it was a divine appointment, and he led me to the Lord. And so I know you know where this is, but it was at a Denny's on Kemp Street, because he wanted a cup of coffee, and I said, well, I don't drink coffee, but I'll have some hot chocolate, so and I don't think I had ever been there before, but anyway, so David, can you share a story about an obstacle that challenged you and your team, and how did tell us a little more about how you overcame that?
That's a great question. It's actually hard to pick one. And so
I know.
One thing I'm really good at is finding obstacles. It's just as an entrepreneur, that's just part of the way it works. But
or they find you, so
that is true. That does happen. So I'll tell you a story about an obstacle that we encountered. So it was in about 2006. We had these two brothers that owned a crane company in Memphis, Tennessee, and they wanted to give away their company, but they wanted to keep stewarding it. And so they came to us and said, help us give away our company. And so one of the things that we've done at NCF is we've tried to kind of build this group of folks that can help crack the code, so to speak, and the code itself to try to help people. But this was a pretty big problem because this is not something that had happened before. And but our folks, including those two gentlemen that I mentioned before who were involved in this process, really put their thinking caps on. And usually you think of engineers and scientists or the kind of inventors, but in our world, as odd as it may sound, tax lawyers and tax accountants are the equivalent of engineers and scientists. And so we actually come up with new and creative ways to accomplish things that have never been done before. And of course, anything that has never been done before can be seen as an obstacle because it's a challenge. You've got to figure out your way around it. But in 2007, 99% of that company was given away. And we figured out how to do that. However, another obstacle came into play because about 5 years later, these brothers came back to us and said, that's not enough. We want to give away 100% of our company and continue to steward it. How can we do that? And so basically we went back to the drawing board, basically put the mad scientists back in the room, and they figured out a way to do that. And so that company, when they gave it away in 07-ish, it was probably worth about 150 million, I'm guessing. And today it's probably worth over $1 billion.
Wow.
And so, and of course, the cash that it's throwing off that's going into the kingdom in the form of grants is tens of millions of dollars every year.
Wow.
So that's an example. It's kind of like R.J. Letourneau. You know who that is, from Longview, Texas. So in the earth moving business, he wrote a great book, several of them actually. And one of the things that he said was, I keep shoveling it out, and God keeps shoveling it back, and his shovel's bigger than my shovel.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's what happened to these two brothers. They keep shoveling it out. And eventually they decided to just, they, one of the spouses of one of these brothers said, when they gave away their company, all of it, she said, our balance sheet has dramatically changed, but our lives have not changed at all. We are now aligned from a spiritual standpoint with where we've always been. We were never the owners.
Yeah.
And we're still not the owners, but we are the stewards, and we're acting as stewards. And so that's an example of what I would call a double obstacle that we were able to overcome.
Yeah. You shared a very important point for any organization, be it business or even a church even. And of course, running a nonprofit ministry and even, educational institution is, it was a big lesson for me. Now, I had a business in the early 90s. The Lord's blessed me to be a visionary, and the challenge for me, you may call it an obstacle, but I can see so far out, it looks real that it's occurring right now. Yeah. And I get, you put, plus I'm impatient, and I'm here I go. I'm going. And I thought I was doing this work for the Lord because we started seeing our work I started seeing my work as a ministry and not a job back in 1987, which was uncommon way back then. And so there was a service offering that didn't exist in the marketplace that I could see down the road that was coming. And I invested about $4 million over about a 3-year period, and it didn't take off. And man, I went to talk to our pastor, and because, man, I was praying a lot. What was I going to do? And of course, you understand this from the banking side, and I kept our bank informed because we could forecast out that we were going to break some covenants at the bank. And you know what happens when you do that? They flag, because the feds are coming in and going to audit the records. And so we had to move our business but the big lesson that I learned from that was that God owned the company, and Bobby Albert was to be the steward. Absolutely. And be honest with you, it was so shocking to me that I argued with the Lord over it. It's like, no, I own this company. Bobby, I own this company, and you're my steward. And it was an expensive lesson, and it was a hard lesson because I had to lay off about 60 employees that we hired during that time period. And it broke my heart letting those people go because I was impacting not only that employee, but their families.
Yep.
And it really broke my heart. So it was a hard lesson for me to learn that. It's also interesting you brought up about Laternal. I spoke, it's been a few years back, at Laternal University at their chapel, and about leading, seeing your work as a ministry and not a job at their chapel. And I think they had about 600 students in attendance or something like that. And but I tailored the discussion about, because I knew that mainly the audience were students, but I knew they would be going into the workplace someday. So for them to see their work as worship, not just a job they went to. So David, what people, that has come beside you over the years that have mentored you, if you mind sharing a little bit about that.
That's something I love to talk about. I'm a big believer that in order to be well grounded, we need to be surrounded. And so I believe that we need people downstream who've been down the river, they're ahead of us. Yeah. I think we need to always have people that are upstream in our lives that we're pouring into, and then there's got to be people paddling alongside us. And so when I think of those downstream people, the mentors, if you will, I'm obviously a very needy person because God has always put lots of people in my life, probably just to keep me from going off the rails. And the first and most important mentor is someone that and that's my dad. And I can get very emotional very easily. But and I can say this, and you can confirm it. Everyone who knows my dad, everyone, 100%, understand why he is my most important mentor. Every single person. That's the kind of man he has been and continues to be, and has been, and he's been my dad. I mean, I'm like, it's a huge win for me that I got a dad like that. And I hope that I seriously can be half the man that he's been. And if I can do that, I will have lived a full life. There's several others. I mentioned the gentleman, Greg Sperry, who kind of got me into this back in 1992. Greg and I have worked together since the first week of 1992, and he's still my mentor. We communicate at least once a week and have since 1992. That's how important he is in my life. But he's been my mentor from a personal standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, a professional standpoint. And he is a big mentor. Terry Parker would be right behind Greg. I mentioned him earlier, the founder of NCF. He's the guy that took the big risk. But Terry has been just an extraordinary example to me. Terry is he's gifted in so many ways. He's one of the most savvy relational people that I've ever met. He knows how to love people. It's not one of my strengths. And he's also extraordinarily gifted from an intelligence standpoint. And he's married to Paula, his wife, who I have also been influenced by as well. But, over my life, and you mentioned Larry Burkett and Ron Blue. I mean, Randy Alcorn, Howard Dayton, Howard Hendricks, another influential. And then just this weekend, Steve Douglas, the former president of Campus Crusade, passed away, and he was a very important mentor in my life. And I could go on and on. So the degree of neediness is extraordinary.
Well, it is fascinating, the position you had there at the National Christian Foundation, that the people that you've been able to interact with and was introduced to and things like that. I know you mentioned about your dad. Actually, it seems like it was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. It'd been a long time that I had seen your dad, and Bob Buford of Halftime had invited couples to spend a day and a half with Ken Blanchard and his wife, and your sister and your dad was there. And I've spent a lot of time, my wife and I spent a lot of time with your sister and your dad, and talked about some things back in Wichita Falls when y'all lived here, because your mom even had a retail store here, and she was way ahead of herself in the kind of retail store she had back then. Yeah, but the story about your dad, the first time I met him, is when I was 20 years old. Life was really good for me. And I just graduated from college at 20 years old at Midwestern, now they call it Midwestern State University here in Wichita Falls, Texas. And I became engaged to marry my wife. And so life was really good to me. And I was waiting. David, you went on to law school, but I was waiting to be accepted to go to law school, which I never did make it there. But what happened is that one evening I was playing foosball with some college buddies, and a friend came up to me and he said, "We just got a call and your dad has been taken to the emergency room. He's had a heart attack." So my buddies, we climbed into the car, rushed down to the hospital. And when I walked in those double doors, my mom stood up at that time. And about that time, our long-term family doctor walked up and he said, "I couldn't save him." And I mean, right then, my mom and I were absolutely stunned, absolutely stunned. And I was at that time thrust to become the leader of this small family business of 5 employees. Very shortly after that, I learned, because your dad was in the banking business, and he had seen me as a little boy, grow up. So what I learned shortly after that, we were heavy in debt. What's shocking, I mean, I don't know how we came out from under it, but our total debt was equivalent to the total gross revenue for 1 year of the company. And it was all the debt was short term. In other words, owed in 1 year. And not only was it your dad, but back then, my dad dealt with 2 other bankers. And at first they wanted, to shut us down and sell off everything and take what was left to pay off as much debt as possible, which still it was going to come up short. So, but you know what? Somehow, and it was, to me, when I look back on it, this is before I became a Christian. Even though I went to church, I knew a lot about God. But it's a God thing that somehow your dad wanted to give me a chance. And he convinced the other 2 bankers who were more, they were pretty hard-nosed, older guys, older than your dad. Somehow he convinced them to give me a chance. And that first year, we were revenue starved. That was our big problem. Well, we grew our revenue with a lot of people helping us by 252%, and we had the highest profit in the history of the company. Well, finally, we were able to pay off the debt. All of a sudden, your dad started loaning me some money now, because I had to use cash flow from the business to operate. And from that be able to take on, be able to get more money is because of this visionary of me. Our company just kept growing until 2011. I sold my company to a publicly traded company. We had over 150 employees, and we were not only much more as a national level type of organization, but also did work internationally as well. So, but your dad was the key that gave me a chance. And I'm just being honest with you. I feel like crying right now because I can't believe I had somebody took a chance on me. And, because they're looking at this 20-year-old, they've seen me they still think of me as a little boy, because I hung out with my dad a lot back then. And anyway, the friendship that I developed over that time with your dad has just been, it's just, I don't know how you explain it, but it was a wonderful experience. And I know you shared that your mom and dad are still I guess they still live in the Dallas area.
Yeah, they split their time between Dallas and Scottsdale, Arizona.
Okay. All right. So, well,
I just want to make one follow-up comment. First of all, I love that story. I just love it. The legacy that I have from my mom and dad is it's just incredible. I just can tell you story after story after story of people, from business people to couples that they have influenced and taken a chance on in different ways. And that's just who they are.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thankful that he took a chance on me. It was a gamble, and it worked. And so that's I'm glad to be able to. I'm glad that you are on this podcast, that I can share that story. Even though you and I think I might have shared this with you when you and I met at the Billy Graham retreat several years ago with Marketplace Chaplain. So, David, we talked about your obstacles that you've overcome. Any other advice you could give to our audience about overcoming obstacles? Anything else you would like to share about that?
Well, I think, people have different perspectives when they even think about the issue of obstacles. I mean, some people see a problem that needs to be solved, and some people see the very same thing as an opportunity that can be seized. Okay. And it can be exactly the same thing. And it's actually, I would say the first thing is, when you do come up across something that is an obstacle, don't go it alone. You really need very capable people around you. You need to be surrounded. You need different skill sets. You need different perspectives at the table, both professional and personal. I'm a big believer that you need both men and women at the table to help really overcome significant obstacles. They just have different ways of seeing things. I also think that the word ingenuity is really important when it comes to obstacles, because obstacles can really they can stop you. And so sometimes you got to figure out, do I go over it, through it, around it, under it? Because we do know that, and of course you want to base everything in prayer when it's an obstacle.
Exactly.
But we know that God will never put an insurmountable obstacle in our way if he wants it to be overcome, it will be.
Yeah.
So put it in his hands.
Yeah.
And he'll help you figure out if you go over, around, under it, or through it. So.
Exactly. It's interesting what you the way you said that, because it made me think, especially our chief operating officer, when he'd come in, I could see the look on his face, because he had the gift for exhortation, and he's an encourager. I used to call him Barnabas, so when he would be coming in and rubbing his head, and because he was bald, I knew, okay, something is not going to be good, here. And he would share an obstacle that's popped up. But he knew I would, just the way you kind of describe it, one of my first question is, what's our options? How can we work through this? And it's just something in me. I love the challenge of obstacles. Do I like obstacles? No, I don't. I'd rather, life be linear, not back and forth and, all those kind of things. But he was always prepared, and we would pull, just like you mentioned, we would pull our leadership team together and talk about, okay, we got this issue, how are we going to overcome it? So, so you're exactly right. Well, David, how has your faith influenced the way you approach the way you lead your team?
Wow. Well, I guess when I think about leading the team, I really think of Jesus as the model. A couple of things come to mind. He was a servant leader. He was God and a servant leader. And so I've got to be a servant leader, and I have to have that mindset, which means that I need to constantly be pressing into being humble. And for me, that means I need people that can be honest with me and speak directly to me when they see me not being that way, because that is not my default. And so another thing that he did was that he was a delegator. And he just didn't delegate action. He also delegated decision making. And so, as we know, building leaders is the way to continue a company into the future. And so that's what he did. Those are three examples, or maybe that was four, of Jesus as a model of how to lead.
I think so many leaders, and with so many Christian leaders, they turning to the Lord early on, and that, when you was talking about the servant leadership, is, I was talking about me being a little boy hanging out with my dad. And I remember 12 years old, my dad let me go out on my first job with a crew. And he, right before we were about ready to go out, man, I was fired up. You got to think, 12 years old. So he pulled me aside and he says, now, Bobby, when you go out there, I don't want you to act like the boss's son. Well, I don't know how to explain it, but somehow at 12 years old, I knew exactly what he meant. So when I went out with that crew, I took on the servant role.
Mm.
And I
Yep.
was constantly asking them, you know, how can I help you? You know, can I do this for you? You know, it, and I carried that through up. I mean, just I still carry it with me today of serving people. But I tell you how important that is in a practical way, because Jesus was the ultimate, you know, servant leader. Is when my dad died, is that those 5 employees, I had to ask them to like take a pay cut. Now today, if you ask employees to take a pay cut, it's not going to be a happy day.
Nope.
But you know, and not only that, these 5 employees, they're looking at this 20-year-old. But you know what? It was shocking to me. Well, let me say this. When I was asking them to take a pay cut, I mean, I never had this kind of fierce conversation with anybody like this. I mean, I was shaking, my lips were shaking, I was sweating, and but I got 100% acceptance, and they stuck with me. And I think it's because they had the confidence that Bobby was going to figure out how to overcome this obstacle like you're talking about.
Yep.
Because they saw my work ethic out there when I'd go out with them on a job. And so, but David, if I can add one other thing, when I saw my work as a ministry and not a job, I took, which you're very familiar with because you probably had it there at the National Christian Foundation, is you know, you had an organization chart, particularly an organization as large as yours. Well, I took the organization chart and turned it upside down. And I took on, just like Jesus said, I'm paraphrasing this, I come not to be served, but to serve. And I took on an attitude to serve our people and to equip them, to develop them and serve them. Our leadership team, they knew they had to do it. To, you know, people reported to them, and on up, you know, in the organization chart, and the frontline people were at the top of the organization chart. And even above them on the front line was the customer. And even above the customer was Jesus Christ, because the foundational verse that was in our company was Colossians 3:23 and 24, and where it addressed that it's the Lord Jesus Christ you're serving. So our employees clearly knew when they came to work every day, they came to work for a higher purpose. And it wasn't to come, because the traditional organization chart, it tells all the employees they come to work for Bobby Albert.
Yeah.
But with them understanding and seeing visually an upside down organization chart, is they knew they were coming to work for a higher purpose to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. So when they served the customer, they were serving the Lord Jesus Christ. When we taught them how to serve each other as a team, they knew they were serving the Lord Jesus Christ. So anyway, I'm preaching now, so, you know, let the fat lady sit down, you know. And, so I've enjoyed you bringing up what you said about that. So David, looking toward the future, what is one potential opportunity or an obstacle that you see on the horizon, and why does this need to be talked about?
Goodness gracious, we could do multiple podcasts.
Yeah, I know.
That's quite a question. Goodness gracious. There's several that come to mind. I won't elaborate. Well, I'll elaborate on one of them. We have this incredible generational thing that's happening in our culture.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with this millennial Gen Z thing? How's that going to play out? We also have a very polarized culture.
Yes.
Increasingly so. How's that going to play out?
Yeah.
And we have global unrest, economic unrest. How are those things going to play out?
Yeah.
And in our world, and this is relevant in more ways than we probably understand, we also are in the middle of the greatest wealth transfer in all of human history.
Yeah.
How's that going to play out? Even though the stock market is not up this year, the amount of wealth that's going to transfer is still in the trillions and trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
And that's going to have a huge impact. Yeah, boy, I guess if I was going to dive a little deeper on one thing, it just comes to mind because of where I was this weekend. I was at a gathering called my wife and I are investors in a thing called the Finishing Fund. And the Finishing Fund is kind of like it's a collaborative funding effort. And the purpose of it is finishing. And so the first finish line is to get the gospel to every unengaged people group on earth. There's 12,000 people groups in the world. In 2005, there were 3,500 of them. And today there are about 200. So that's how many have been engaged. So an unengaged people group means that there's no known believer, no worker, no church, no scripture, nothing. So in 2005, there were 3,500 of those people groups, hundreds of millions of people. Today, 200 and probably about 10 million people. And so a huge milestone is getting ready to happen in the history of the church.
Yeah.
But the big obstacle is that there's probably about that same 3,500 that have been engaged in the last 17 years.
Yeah.
I would call them marginally engaged. They're barely engaged. And one of the things that you don't want to have happen if you're in a war is for your enemy to retake a hill that you've successfully taken.
Yeah.
That's happening in Ukraine right now, and it's crippling the Russian.
Yeah.
It's causing them to do things that are horrendous. But that's what's happening, and we don't want that to happen. So a big obstacle is how do we now go to basically these 4,000 people groups, however many there are, whatever it is, and take them from being marginally engaged to securely engaged.
Yeah.
In other words, multiplying churches, multiplying disciples. It's we've hit some incredible milestones, but now we need to start fund 2 and start securing these engaged. So that's one of the biggest opportunities in the world, and so that's something we ought to be talking about.
Yeah, I love that thought because a daily prayer I have is because our whole world, personally as well around us, is just right now we're in this spiritual warfare that's going on, and our world is just turned upside down right now, and we need changed hearts. That's my prayer. And not only for unbelievers, but we need believers to go from being secured by the Holy Spirit to being filled by the Holy Spirit. And but so that's exactly, it sounds like exactly what you see is we need changed hearts. And
one of the things that all those other obstacles that I mentioned, one of the things that those cause to happen is they actually cause the gospel to spread faster.
Yeah.
And for change to occur more quickly. And so globally, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're seeing Aslan on the move in breathtaking ways that have never before been seen in the church.
Yeah.
In fact, the hotter it gets in the kitchen, the more it seems that people are coming to Christ and being committed to Him.
Yeah.
And so it's a tension. but it's absolutely breathtaking what's happening in the world today. So
Yeah,
you're living in the best time in all of human history. I know that sometimes it doesn't feel that way,
exactly.
but you are living in the best time in all of human history. So.
Yeah. Well, I think I know you understand this. God's plan is always perfect, even though we don't know, we don't understand it a lot of times, but it does. It is perfect. So, hey, David, is there anything else or story you'd like to share with us today?
I think we've covered all the bases we need to cover this time. Maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, well, I've truly enjoyed reconnecting with you, and maybe one of these days you'll get back to Wichita Falls, and you and your wife, and cover some old neighborhoods and things. So, David, where can people go to connect with you and learn more about the National Christian Foundation?
The website is ncfgiving.com. So that's the main place to go. And you can learn all about it.
Yeah, and we'll have that in the show notes. So,
okay,
David, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure to reconnect. And by the way, you look a lot like your dad.
I know.
Way back then.
I know.
So,
so not everything he gave me was great. So, you know.
Well,
you can tell him I said that if you see.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's been a pleasure to reconnect with you, and thank you for being on the show.